Hi, I'm Darren Stehle, and this is Think Queerly, a thought leadership podcast that cultivates inclusion, understanding, and social evolution for a more accepting, equitable, and humane world. Now, on the show, I explore LGBTQS plus history and social justice. I'll also speak with other queer leaders who are working to make a meaningful difference in their communities and for the world. So on today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Jade Pichette. They are the Director of Programs at Pride at Work Canada. Jade is an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility professional based in Toronto. And currently they serve as the Director of Programs at Pride at Work Canada, where they work with over 250 large employers across Canada around gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation inclusion. Jade, thank you so much for joining me on the Think Queerly podcast.
Thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to join you after we connected, and I'm calling in today from Tkarón, from Treaty 13 territory, which was signed with the Mississaugas of Credit, as well as the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. And as a white settler calling in from this territory that's traditionally home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit peoples. I'm very grateful to be a person who lives in Tkarón or Toronto and calling in from here today.
Let's start with where we're sort of at right now, maybe the last couple of months where summer seems to be winding down. And I don't know if it's a lot of fun for you or if it's a lot of work, but you've been on a couple of months of literally touring across the country for various prides in different cities from large to small. I think hosting events, speaking. I know, I think you were published some articles in one of the Calgary newspapers, which had, of course, some challenging responses, but maybe this will give people a little understanding of the in-community, face-to-face work that you're doing. So take some time. Tell me a little bit about what you've been up to for Pride at Work this summer.
Yeah, so I certainly, I enjoy my job. I enjoy getting to travel and to really connect with people from coast to coast to coast. But it is tiring. It can be a tiring season because Pride for us lasts from basically the end of May until the beginning of September. Starting with Winnipeg at the end of May / beginning of June, and then Calgary at the end of August, beginning of September. And so I don't travel to all of them. We do have a really amazing team. We've tripled in size over the pandemic, which has been a wild journey, I must say. But I do get to go to some of them and support the others remotely and get members of my team to go. So, within that, we really have been trying to get out there again after basically 2 years of only being virtual and not doing anything in person. And, as a disabled person, getting out and traveling quite a bit has been a bit anxiety producing, but it's also been exciting. It's really exciting to actually be able to reconnect, because I think our community and queer and trans and two-spirit communities were based on connection. That's what our communities are based on. It's based on connection, and some people can find that online and feel fulfilled from that. But there's a lot of us who need more than that. We need that in-person connection and networking, and it's really powerful to get to see the actual experiences of people in terms of hearing in person their experiences regarding employment, and then being able to speak to that in different areas of the country. And really, one of the things that I have found one of the most interesting is that when I do travel, so like I was in Winnipeg, I was in Halifax, I was in Calgary, in all of those cities, I would hear, oh, we're so behind. Oh, we have so much work to do. And the stories would be similar, no matter where we go. And so it's really important also to build that kind of national feeling and national connection. And between the travels, trying to get other things in, like presentations, like some of our virtual programming, as well as you mentioned, I did get involved in some media, which made was pretty impactful, seeing as it's very rare for trans inclusion in particular, but queer inclusion overall as well, to be focused in business sections of newspapers, including
Oh,
conservative ones.
great.
For that type of recognition, it is something that I think has an impact, because we don't see many people who are trans in senior roles. We don't see that very commonly. And so it's really powerful, I think, for some other folks to be able to just see that, and also to, hear the work that is being done, and to know that, there's people who have their back, essentially. So.
Right. Well, a couple of questions based on what you said. An easy, maybe it's not an easy one. Was there a favorite location for a particular pride?
I mean, each pride brings its own flavor, its own perspective, its own experiences. But for me, my favorite this year, I'm specifying, was Halifax,
Okay.
because I haven't been to Halifax as an adult, so that for me was kind of the first time that I got to do it, and also it was the first time I've ever brought somebody on a work trip with me. So I had my partner with me. And so we got to see the East Coast, see Halifax, connect with the community there. And it just gives a much deeper understanding for me in terms of kind of what the local issues there were.
Yeah.
But as I feel like we've both been in this game for a while, which is not the case for a lot of folks. It's when you start looking at the decades of doing queer work, it has a moment. And so, having done that for so long, I remember times where, very few people would be public. There were very few, prides. There was very few legal representations. As far as I knew, I was the only out trans teen in Ottawa when I came out. And I nearly cried in Halifax just because of all the kids, all the like accepting parents, and really like with the Halifax pride, that's what I saw was kids from one end to the other, which I don't see that with every pride. I see a lot more kids than I used to at all prides. But I mean, when I went to Pride with my mom as a kid, like I was one of the only kids around for sure. So seeing so many children is just like, it warms my heart so deeply. And also you can't get good garlic fingers when you're in Ontario or out West. So going to Halifax was my favorite for this year, but doesn't mean there wasn't things I loved about other cities, and that I think other cities have to them. So,
Yeah. Well, being Toronto based, quite some time ago, or a few months ago, I did an interview with one of the directors of Small Town Pride. And I forget which city exactly in Halifax. That was one of the three. But there's just something about small, it sort of brings shivers. I remember when I went to Carleton University, I was there for 10 years, and celebrating Pride there was such a different experience than celebrating it in Toronto. But nonetheless, like you said, for all of us, even this year here in Toronto, going out was such a different experience after, waiting 3 years, and to be
yeah,
amongst our people and to feel that freedom, and to also just be able to like dance outside again. So there were multiple layers of connection and community that were happening all at the same time, expressed with the freedom of, okay, yeah, we can hug our friends. I mean, some people may be more cautious still with COVID restrictions, but if we spent all of our time outside so that we wouldn't be jammed like a sardine, where you could still
yeah.
maybe catch COVID in a cramped bar, right? But yeah, it was a wonderful experience this year. It almost made Pride that much more meaningful.
It did. It did. Especially, I never thought we would see Pride not happen. Especially in like Toronto, there are some cities who've had historically challenges with keeping their pride committees going. So like Edmonton is one example of that. They've had a lot of challenges in terms of keeping their pride going. But even with some of the cities where we see kind of some turnover in terms of the pride committees, like Ottawa and Montreal, some of those main cities, I never really thought we would not see pride happen, right? It's too important.
And this is what happened in Montreal. We were in Montreal, and the interesting thing to interject here is on the I think it was the Saturday, we were walking down, I forgot the name of the street where our hotel was, and we're like, oh, what's going on? And it was actually the trans march that was going was it going north? If my directions might be messed up. But anyway, it was like, oh, fantastic. So we got to see a parade. We got to see the parade that was representative of Montreal, because last minute it was canceled on the Sunday. So it was like, wow, how lucky were we at the right time to be able to see this. And it was so highly organized, and everybody was having such a great time. And it was like hot, like it was sunny and hot. I guess it was about 6 or 7 p.m. when they were marching. So I'm like, well, there you go. For one of the first times ever, trans people got to go first. And they got the parade. So it's kind of a strange irony there. But
I mean, historically, we have been the ones going first, regardless. So, regardless of whether it's been accepted or not. I mean, I know even here in Toronto, like we've had a trans march since 2009. I was at the first one that they had, although their claim is it was the first trans march ever in Canada, which is not true. Right. But there was a trans march in Ottawa in 2006 that I was a part of, and which was very small, but it wasn't a continuous thing, but it did happen. And as we know, going back to Stonewall and the like, trans folks, we've been there and leading the way, even if we have occasionally been shoved to the side. And with Montreal, I mean, they have a really dedicated new group of organizers, right? It's a completely new committee this year. And I think sometimes when it comes to a new committee, you lose some of that historical knowledge. And, my last job was at the Archives, Canada's LGBTQ2+ archives. And so like my knowledge of queer history is a bit higher than most. It's one of the things that I love and care about. But I think it's something that we end up losing sometimes. And we sometimes see that through how things happen in terms of organizing and the like, because there isn't this ongoing connection, this ongoing knowledge. And so things that are organized more intentionally by like small communities sometimes go forward, but then other things can sometimes get canceled. And, community challenges can happen. Like, for instance, in Ottawa, their Dyke March didn't happen this year last minute, which as a former Ottawa Dyke March organizer who was back in the city for the first time in many, many years, it was a bit heartbreaking, but, they still had the picnic. And even in Montreal, they still had people who took to the streets when the parade didn't happen. So, that need for connection and community is something that we see in, every area of our lives. And I think, it's something that translates as well into the workplace. A feeling of belonging, a feeling of connection is something that we as, everybody does, but especially as queer and trans folks who have been consistently not given that connection by our community, sometimes our families, sometimes our religion, sometimes, all of these different pieces. We search for that and we try to find that. And sometimes the workplace is one of the few places where we also look for that, though, of course, often don't find it as well. So yeah, that need for connection is something that we see so deeply in our communities.
And that's the perfect segue to sort of what I said about having two questions. And I, not to make this difficult on you, because it might be something you don't want to answer. So I'll give you a way out if you say, no, I don't want to answer that. It's more of a challenge of where do you, in your travels over the summer, in the work that you did in relation to businesses representing pride at work, what really stood out, or what was really impactful? Was there a transformative moment that just gave you that sense of, wow, this is really important work that we're doing, and this is actually helping people?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't think there's one moment per se. That's the piece that's hard to answer, because there were multiple. I especially, so when the pandemic hit, we were a team of 4 full-timers and 1 part-timer. And 90% of nonprofits in Canada had their budgets cut that year. And because we are a member services organization, we're very based on those membership fees. We have no core funding from government. It's all a community-based organization and funded by the programs that we put on. And so I think a lot of people think we have a lot more access than we do because of that, because we work with so many different organizations, but we work with them because they're accessing our programming. And that's how we have our funding, although they pay for the fee, they don't get to choose what we do, which is an important distinction, because I don't think that's true for all organizations that have funding from large employers. And so over that pandemic, we really tried to pivot real quick, because although we had a webinar series, we're not a virtual organization. We're an in-person organization, primarily, right? Like, even our webinar series was only 2 years old at that point. Even though our organization's been around since 2008, we very much had been focused on these in-person networking and educational events across the country, where we'd have that, more in-depth discussion. And so we switched to kind of doing, for the first little while, in-person or virtual events every Wednesday at noon Eastern time, because then that's 9 a.m. Pacific and 1:30 in Newfoundland. And so it's kind of one of the better times. There's no perfect time, but it was one of the better times. And we would have people who started like sending stuff in the chat saying, like, this is the one thing I'm looking forward to. This is the one thing that's consistent in my life right now, which, as an organization focused on just like employment equity and inclusive employment and things like that, it was, kind of shocking, because even though my background's in social work, we're not a social service organization, right? And so, but people were still getting that connection. But it's also still hard after 2 years of not seeing people and just talking at a screen to see what type of impact that you're making. The feeling of that impact is different, because it's kind of like, I put things out into the world, but what is actually happening with that? Are we actually having an impact? What is that? And this summer, people reminded us in every city that we went. In every city that I went to, I at least had one, but usually multiple people come up to me being like, I've watched your webinars, I've watched your programming, we did this specific thing to make some change. And so, like, one of the last moments, which I'll use as the example, was in Calgary. And because that was the last city that we did for our Pride series. And one person came up to me and asked for a selfie, and like, oh my goodness, everybody's going to be excited at the office if I have a selfie with you, which is like very weird to me in some ways, because I'm like, I'm just a community worker. That's all I am, right? And so I'm not a musician. I'm not an artist. I'm a community worker who just does community work at a nonprofit. So being treated almost like a rock star that you need to get a photo with, it was a bit odd. But after that meeting and like meeting up, she actually sent me an email, and she sent me an email saying about how touched she was at the event, and talked about the changes that they had made at their organization over the last couple of years since they became members of ours. And that really touched me. That moment really touched me because it showed that the recommendations that we are given are actually making change. Because I find one of the things is that's like really powerful in this job is that I actually do get to talk to people about making very specific changes on a semi-regular basis. And sometimes those are the people, and often they are the people who are, directors of HR, they're the manager of diversity, equity, and inclusion, whatever that role is, the head of their employee resource group. So people who actually have capacity to make changes within their organization. And we talk about the very specific changes, whether that's to their data, to their policies, their procedures, their benefits, and more. And so I get to hear and talk to them about that, but then I don't get to talk about those pieces publicly because they're all confidential. And so to have people do it in person, in public, is really a powerful thing, and something that means a lot, because I really, I and everybody on our team, yes, we get paid because people deserve to be paid. People thought I was just a volunteer. I'm like, no, this is my full-time job. But the people on our team, we're here because we care about the work that we do, and we want to make that difference. And we want to make sure that Two-Spirit, queer, and trans folks have inclusive employment in Canada, because we know currently they don't, even if we've made a lot of progress. But we also have had a lot of backslides more recently as well. So it's those moments, not explicitly just one, but it's all those little moments that come up, and people say that they, feel more seen, that they don't feel alone, that they feel like that, they tell us about the organizational changes that they've made. It's those moments that really remind me why we're doing what we're doing.
No, it's wonderful. So is this still going on, the Pro Pride series, or was that what you were delivering over the summer?
So that's what we deliver over the summer. So Pro Pride is one of our oldest programs. So when we were formed in 2008 by mostly lawyers and folks on in the financial industry on Bay Street, because that's where we started. We're very beyond that now in terms of the different industries we work with, but that's where we started, and it's important to honor those roots. We started with Toronto Pro Pride as a networking event because, keep in mind that in 2008, most companies didn't sponsor prides. They weren't involved in prides. They didn't have their own pride events. In fact, the first bank, which if you go to any pride these days, almost with the exception of a few small ones, there's some bank that's sponsoring it, right? But previous to 2004, that was the first time a bank had ever sponsored a pride event. And there's a lot of controversy over that within the community about people's opinions on that, which I won't really comment on one way or another. But think of that history of the fact that in 2008, we didn't have events that even most of the banks or law firms or basically any company were doing this type of space for people to connect that were Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and more. So we started with Toronto Pro Pride and then Montreal Pro Pride, and moved over to Calgary and Vancouver and Halifax and more. But that series is something we try to do every year because we try to have that connection. The last 2 years, it's been entirely virtual Pro Prides. But this year we went back to having Pro Prides in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. And we had live streams of all of them to make them more accessible, both in terms of location as well as COVID sense if people wanted to participate in the panel and see the panel, but they weren't able to feel comfortable to come in person. And we also had a virtual Pro Pride this year. So we tried to, provide that space. But we're very excited because we were starting to plan our 15th anniversary, which will be our next fiscal. So starting May 2023. And so we want to get even further out there, which we may spread out further throughout the year in comparison to historically our Pro Pride series, where our team works really, really ridiculously over a Pride season, especially because a lot of companies and large employers forget we exist for at least 10 months of the year. And then it's like, oh no, Pride's coming up. So that's why they remember in May that we exist. And then there's June, and then they forget we exist again sometimes. But with that in mind, we take the opportunity and we make the impact that we can with that focus. And I think every equity deserving group organization does that with whatever observance that's going on, because every company does this around every different issue. It's not just us. It's not just Pride. It's just the way that things tend to go. But we really want to make sure that there's focus on our programs throughout the year. So our series might look a little different for our 15th anniversary year than it has historically. But that's just kind of a sneak peek into what might be coming, or will be coming, I should say.
So in a sense, I've sort of started with like impact and connection and community without going into, it's like, okay, so what is Pride at work? And you've sort of teasing out what the outcome is. Besides whatever new you're working on beyond Pro Pride, like upcoming research, what are the different ways in which, like, say a company engages with you and, they may later on say, let's do something specific for Pride, but they reach out to you. What is it they're looking for? What are you offering them, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're a member services nonprofit. So every employer that we work with pays us an annual $5,000 membership fee, which we actually haven't changed since 2008. Was $5,000. So it's actually less money now if you count inflation, with more impact and more programming. We've just gone from the model of let's get more partners on and more people to access this, instead of like, let's raise the price. And so within that, we provide a number of different things, including monthly webinars in English on kind of 201, diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. So for instance, we have one next month on psychological safety and coming out at work, in connection with Coming Out Day. We're doing ones in November of this year around in English and in French around LGBTQ IA plus newcomers and their inclusion in the workplace. So we really try to look at those intersections, as well as give webinars around direct tips. So we've done ones around like inclusive hiring practices. So if you're doing a virtual application process, what's the most inclusive way to set up that application? And really try to drill down onto what is the direct intersectional realities within our community. We just did one on bisexual inclusion in the workplace, and we had so many people saying, oh my goodness, we need more on bisexual inclusion in the workplace. Like, can we go deeper on this? Which is definitely a need, seeing as with the research that we recently did, we found that bisexual people are the most economically disadvantaged when it comes to sexual orientation in Canada by far. Bisexual women make less than half of what a heterosexual man makes in Canada. And bisexual men make less than straight men, gay men, or lesbians, and around the same amount as straight women. And so, we really try to look at those intersections with those programming, as well as very direct pieces like, as I said, the inclusive hiring. I did one through our member workshop series, which our webinars, we get external presenters. Our member workshops, which we do less frequently, we do with folks from our team because we're asked more for our own expertise. And so I did one on inclusive benefits and what are some of the things that you need to be thinking about in terms of the different challenges to accessing benefits, including even some of the nitty gritty around, like, if your broker doesn't understand how to access these, none of the things that I've talked about are going to work out. And so how do you work with the broker even? And really trying to get to that nitty gritty. And so our webinar series has really kind of taken off and made a big impact because it's accessible in a way that, so some other things aren't. But we try to make sure that we have other programming as well that goes very, very deep. So like we have our workplace audit program that has an employer look at every different section of their organization in terms of policies, procedures, executive sponsorship, employee resource groups, community outreach, data, what we like to call the pink plateau. So how higher 2S LGBTQIA plus folks reaching in the organization. And we give direct feedback. So we give direct evaluation of that. None of this is public. It's all private and confidential, but it helps them then make a strategic plan around their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts around sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and really also, lean on our expertise in terms of what are some of the things that we've seen in their industry, in their size of the organization, in the location of their organization, that we've seen at other companies where or I should say large employers, because not all the employers we work with are companies, where we really get to be able to talk about, more broadly what we're seeing as trends without having to out those specific companies on their confidential information, but just making sure that everybody is up to best practice, especially because with, the greater understanding of identities, of different identities within the community, there's also a continuous learning curve when it comes to our communities that I think should be happening for every equity deserving group, but definitely is one that has been recognized as something to go a little farther on. And so with the audit, I also will do like consulting calls, and I sometimes will do those separate to the audit program as well. Just quick calls with our partners, or sometimes emails giving them advice on their policy. If they send it our way, we'll give it a quick look, actually give some feedback on it. So we try to have kind of the, these are the webinars, the panels, the member workshops to kind of give, these are the best practices or these are the challenges. Then we try to have kind of this more direct consulting piece where we say, okay, we're working with you on this. What does that actually look like in terms of the changes that you can make? And then we also try to have different ways for people who are 2S LGBTQIA plus leaders or employees who are working on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, inclusion in their workplaces to connect. So one of our member-only services is our ambassador program, which is based in a number of parts of the country with local representatives from our partner networks. So in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Montreal, Halifax, and St. John's. We have folks from our community partner network who meet up, they connect, they learn from each other. They say, okay, you're doing this. How about we partner on this? They have local discussions, and they really try to have that like next level of knowing and understanding. But we also try to create things for different groups. So for instance, we have a public program called Rendezvous, which happens a couple times a year. That's for women and non-binary folks to connect. We bring in a guest speaker and have a specific networking space, because we've found that in a lot of networking spaces for our communities, they tend to be a bit sexist, to be quite honest. Yeah. Sometimes in some of those spaces, men are only there to meet other men. and don't want to talk to anybody who isn't a man. And that's a harsh reality of our community sometimes. It's not an overarching thing, but that's one of the reasons why we have Rendezvous. And similarly, we see for trans, non-binary, and agender communities that we don't have places to connect usually. So we have matrices as well for that type of connection. And then we have a few leadership programs, which are an additional fee, but our partners get a discount on one for people who are in a management track. So Two-Spirit queer and trans managers, or people who are on that management line of things. And that's our Thrive program. And then also our Flourish program, which is actually starting, or our second version of it is October and November 2022. And that's for employee resource group leaders and Snake Week program. So we try to have kind of these different focuses to build up the organizations from that, very direct consulting support. This is, what we need to do in terms of best practice. The direct virtual programming of these are best practices, these are the challenges, the pieces for members of our community who are leaders, who are making progress, or who are just trying to network, our professionals. And then kind of the fourth bucket that I would add is our engagement with ongoing research on these issues, because in terms of employment equity for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, there's not many people doing that work out there or doing that research, right? So it's something that we try to get involved in and support and do as much as we can. And then our partners are some of the first to get to see that emerging research or participate in it as well. So
that's just a couple of things.
We're obviously not doing much over here. I'm sure there's other things I could add too, but that's we have our e-learning and many other things, but that's kind of us in a nutshell.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, to put one more thing on the top of that bucket, why don't we transition into this new project, your Uncover Belonging podcast? And I believe today or this week you just produced your fourth episode. What is that all about? What is the purpose? What do you hope to accomplish with that?
Yeah, so the Uncovering Belonging podcast is a project between myself and Aaron Davis, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator based in Edmonton, Alberta. And she previously was at Catalyst, and before that was at Stantec, doing DEI work and DEI roles. And since has gone independent, and her and I have always really hit it off and worked very collaboratively together, both when she was at Stantec and when she was at Catalyst. And we both had been thinking about a podcast and doing a podcast. Neither of us, Darren, realized how much work it is. So kudos to you. People don't realize just how much work doing a podcast is. Yeah. But we really, we're fascinated by these ideas of uncovering and belonging. So uncovering being this idea that in the workplace, many of us, and this can apply to other areas of life, but within the workplace, many of us hide pieces of who we are. Right. Yeah. So there may be pieces of ourselves that we can't choose to hide. So sometimes that means we're visible in terms of our disability or our racial category, or, sometimes being trans or queer even. I would argue that not all queer people are invisible and minorities. And I have issue with that conception. And however, there's other parts of ourselves that we may be able to cover or hide. Mm-hmm. And we often make that decision about whether we're going to be our true selves or not, based on whether it's safe. And we feel a sense of safety. So for instance, for myself, I can't hide that I'm trans. That's not something that happens. My entire career has been in queer work. It's been my life, and it's not something that I can hide. However, for a long time, I personally covered some of my disabilities. I covered that I was autistic. I covered that I had ADHD. I covered that I had chronic pain, because sometimes I could cover those things. Not always, but sometimes. And so, that was really something that we wanted to look at, because if people don't feel psychologically safe, they're not going to uncover. And if they're not going to uncover, they're not going to feel a sense of belonging. So belonging being this idea that, we're all searching for connection. We're going back to kind of our earlier conversation. We're all searching for connection. We all want to find a space where we feel that we are welcome, that we belong, that we are a part of that space in a deep way, right? And so belonging has really come out of this discussion where diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't do enough, right? Because diversity says who's in the room. Equity says how do we make sure that people are able to get into the room. Inclusion says, does everybody feel like they can say something at the table? But belonging looks at the fact that we need to also recognize who built the room. Have people been involved in choosing the music? Have people been involved in the creation of the space as a whole? Because if you have, then you feel a sense of belonging. You feel a sense of connection. And so with this podcast, we really wanted to explore and talk to all the really great, diversity, equity, inclusion folks that we know who are really trying to do that work in terms of creating that space for others. And we wanted to find out their story and, where was their sense of belonging and how they can uncover. And sometimes the answer has been, I haven't found my own sense of belonging yet. And I think that's okay with the podcast as well, because we need to be honest that, for many of us, we may still feel a lack of belonging in many, many spaces, especially if we are intersectionally marginalized, right? So if we experience multiple marginalizations, like for myself as somebody who's trans, who's disabled, who's feminine, who's femme of center, so I experience, trans misogyny and sexism and the like, that is going to be a experience where there are going to be very few spaces where there is people just like me, right? However, I am white and I was born in Canada. So I do have, and I also have a master's. So I have certain privileges as well. And so there's certain things where I may not realize that I'm affecting my power in that space as well. But really to create that sense of belonging is something that can be done when people come from different experiences. They just all have to feel a sense of ownership and that they've built it together. And we really try to do that on like an internal basis and role model what that looks like through our own processes at Pride at Work Canada. I mean, we actually won the Best Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Employer under 20 staff from Charity Village this past year, which it was the first time they did the Charity Village Awards. So we're very honored to win the very first year. But that's because, none of us are exactly the same, right? Within our team, we all have different experiences. Half the team was born outside of Canada. Half the team is able to speak multiple languages. I'm envious of them because I can't. But, we all bring those different pieces of ourselves and are able to build up the space together and be welcoming of that difference. But I think most employers and most spaces are built by one type of group of people and then say, oh, we need to include or have these other faces or voices at the table, but not recognize that you built the table. We need to relook at how the table is. Maybe the table is not high enough for people in mobility devices to get in. Maybe the table is too high for some people. Maybe we need to not have a table. It's really about rethinking how we create space. And sometimes we have to go back and create a new space to find that sense. But we've had so many different interesting folks on so far. So the most recent episode was with Jake Stitka, who, was probably one of the only straight cisgender white men that I'll probably interview. But even for him, he was talking about how his experience of patriarchy and sexism and misogyny and what we tell boys, what we tell men, in terms of how they need to interact, was still this intensely important discussion of belonging, because it's something that honestly I think most men don't feel either.
Yeah.
And we talk about belonging from the sense of often, the marginalized folks, but if people with power as well don't have that sense, or I should say with privilege, not necessarily with power, because sometimes you can have certain privileges and still not have much power in our society. But I think that's something that all of us are searching for. And so, with the episode before that, episode 3 with David Lewis Pert, he talked about this importance of calling across difference and conversations across difference. And I think that's also something that we really need to look at when we look at belonging, when we look at uncovering, because we're all going into our own little bubbles these days, right? And I think, social media algorithms, that's a whole nother conversation we could have. But, I think that there's a lot of things currently which have a lot of positive power too, but are also dividing us and making it so that we can't talk to each other. And if we can't talk to each other, we can't create a space where we all feel like we belong. And so I've been very grateful to be doing this podcast, and for all the support from, our editor, Sean Ahmed, and my colleague, Luis Augusto Nobre on communications, and Connor Pion when it comes to production support. Connor used to work at a radio station briefly, so I'm very grateful for him, because I'm not the organized one of the bunch. I could talk, I could be the face, I could be the person to chat, but I'm grateful for the more organized members of my team.
Wonderful. So. Well, good. I'm envious, jealous of the fact that you have a team. It is me. So I know the work and the research, the preparation, and then finding the right services, and then having the time to do things right, and figuring out, should it go here, should it go there. But just sort of we'll bring everything up towards a conclusion here. But I love this conversation about belonging and acceptance, because this is what I do in my mind mastery, self-mastery coaching with clients. And I just had a discovery session with someone yesterday, and that's really the big thing we were talking about, like from a neuroscience perspective. Like our animal brain, the mammalian brain, that's the social brain that wants acceptance and connection and care, the anterior cingulate cortex. That's another word for love. And, attention is often, as a baby, a parent staring into the child's eyes, if it's getting, good love and good care, and the cooing and the touching and then the belong, as opposed to trying to fit in. And so many of us in the queer community may have had an experience of, if we were in a closet, that we were on the margins. My own perceptual experience, was always as an observer, until I started to come to terms with my identity as a gay man, and then starting to evolve into understanding what queerness means for me, and then finding my own. So understanding, listening to your experience, and what are the things that make you feel like you might be on the margins, or that you don't have these spaces where you feel like you can belong. And I have an article that's going to be coming out later this week on appealing to our innate human dignity instead of trying to incite further argument and division. It is such a difficult place to come from if you're already in the heat of the argument. And that is. That reminds me of something you and I talked about when we first met to talk about this podcast. And I think you said something like, I have more, you were saying that you have more leverage in your role now to make sure more change than ever. And you referenced something Stacey Abrams said, and I quote, "When you're focused on your enemy, then you're ignoring your allies." And I think there's two really important points there. We can move mountains when we work with other people that want to help us move that mountain. And in moving that mountain together, we're coming from a place of belonging and acceptance and connection and care. And it doesn't mean we're trying to move that mountain over other people.
No.
But we're leading by example to say, this is a big project, metaphorically, the mountain. We recognize there's a lot of resistance in our way, but we're doing this together.
Yeah. And that's something that I think there's so much space for. I think we have so many people who, at their core, and maybe this is just me being an optimistic Sagittarius, but at the core, I truly believe that people are just looking for connection. They're just looking to live a decent life. And for most people, that is what they're looking for and what they need. And so if most people are looking for that, there's so much space to connect, to build together, to grow, to, move a mountain or find a different way. Maybe we need to honor the mountain. Maybe we need to take care of the mountain. Maybe we need to just find ways like around the mountain together, and really be able to think up new ways, or even going back to old ways. And by what I mean by that is, decolonize some of our thinking in terms of like solutions and in terms of how we create solutions, and really create some of that space for each other. Because I think we have so many people who really care. And I think one of the points that Deepak Kashyap, who was in the first episode of the Uncovering Blogging podcast, one of his mentors said to him that is really ringing in my head right now, is that she was speaking to him and saying, you believe that the reasons for the problems in the world is because of human evilness or wrongness. But I believe, and so that was her speaking, that it is the result of human weakness. And that has resonated with me very strongly. It's not that anybody is, well, there may be a few people, but for the majority, people just want to have community. They want to have connection. And there's enough of us who are doing this work. We don't need to compete. There's no reason for us to compete because there is so much work to do. So let's look at ways that we can work together, that we can, move that mountain, move around that mountain, find different ways with that mountain, and create those spaces together.
Beautiful. Well, maybe I can ask you like a final thought question, give you an opportunity for a thought leadership question here. Not that you haven't been doing that for the last 50 minutes here, but is there a core message or philosophy, whether it's your own or in the work that you do, and it could of course overlap, that you would share with our listeners?
Well, maybe I'll share the point that I have on my work badge. So I'm a Githya. So within my religious community, which is essentially the traditional beliefs of Northern Europe pre-colonization. So we believe in, we're animists. We see life everywhere. We have multiple gods, but primarily the focus is our community and the connections that we make within community. And one of the statements that we use quite often, which I have put on my work badge to remind me every day, is we are our deeds. And I think sometimes when it comes to this work, we get very held up when it comes to the words that we use. We get very held up on the way that we're perceived. But really, when it comes to this type of work, when it comes to belonging, when it comes to building community, it can be messy, it can be hard, it can be all of these things. But at the end of the day, the actions that you take are what is more important. So if you take actions that are inclusive, that are accountable, that are compassionate, everything that you do, even if you make mistakes, is going to make a positive influence in the long run.
Beautiful. Well, where do people go to find out more about Pride at Work and the podcast?
Yeah, so Pride at Work Canada, and it's important to add the Canada on there because there is a Pride at Work in the US, which is a labor organization, and Pride at Work UK, which is a DEI like consultancy in the UK. So Pride at Work Canada, so prideatwork.ca, or you can find us on Twitter, Pride at Work Can, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. I'm not the social media person, but you can find them in all those places. And then in terms of myself, you can find me on Twitter at Jade Pichette, or on LinkedIn. Please feel free to send me a LinkedIn request. Of course, Pride at Work Canada is on LinkedIn as well. And in terms of the podcast, you can find it on basically anywhere that you look for your podcasts. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcaster, and many, many more. Or you can just go directly onto the Pride at Work Canada website and go to the podcast link.
Jade Pichette, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've given me today. I know you've got a very busy schedule, so I appreciate you showing up and telling me more about Pride at Work. And I look forward to diving into some of the episodes on Uncover Belonging podcast.
Thank you so much, Darren. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, hello again, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of Think Queerly with Jade Pichette. It was a really informative and thoughtful interview for me, and I really appreciate towards the end when we talked about belonging and acceptance and care. This is what is so meaningful to me in the work that I do, that I talk about on the podcast, that I write about on my Substack, Queering Self-Mastery, and in the work that I do with my coaching clients. My purpose, my mission, I guess you could also call it, is when you freely love who you are, you can freely create a life you love. And that depends on acceptance. That depends on feeling like you belong. That depends on feeling like you have the freedom to pursue your purpose, but also to be who you are without any blocks, without anything holding you back. And that's going to make the difference in whatever it is you create, whatever it is you are seeking to change, the impact that you want to have on your community or on the world. So if that's something that you're interested in, if you're having a struggle or if you're challenged by any of those issues in your own life, I'd love to have a conversation. I start by meeting you where you're at, in a discovery session, which is entirely complimentary. And I'll have the link in the show notes below. You can also head over to my website, darrenstehle.com, and look for the Let's Work Together or Working Together menu option. And you'll find out more about the kind of coaching that I offer and how we can connect. As always, thanks for listening. And if you can't think straight, think queerly.